The night his oldest friend set him up as a joke, Ethan understood something he'd somehow missed for 41 years. Most people decide who matters long before they ever bother to look. His name was Ethan Cole. He was 41 years old, and he restored furniture for a living, the kind of slow, patient work where you strip 60 years of varnish off a dresser someone's grandmother had loved and found honest wood underneath. He'd been divorced for a little over 2 years. Not a dramatic divorce, no shouting, no thrown plates. Just a quiet drift, a woman who had married the idea of a steady man and then discovered that steady, up close, looked a lot like Tuesday nights and early bedtimes. He didn't blame her. He just stopped expecting things the way a man does when he's tired but not bitter, and he filled the quiet with sandpaper and stain and the low hum of the shop radio. So when his friend Mark called and said the group was getting dinner Friday and that Ethan was coming whether he liked it or not, Ethan said yes, mostly because saying no had started to feel like its own kind of confession. The restaurant was one of those mid-tier places that printed its menus too proudly, where the potatoes had 4 adjectives in front of them, and the prices climbed every time someone said the word rustic. Ethan got there early the way he always did, because being early meant he never had to walk into a room that was already watching him. He did not know, sitting there turning a water glass in slow circles, that the dinner had a second purpose. He did not know that Russ with the loud laugh and the gym shoulders and the habit of narrating his own jokes before he told them, had arranged the seating. He did not know that there was an empty chair beside him on purpose, or that the whole table had been let in on something he hadn't. She arrived 11 minutes late, and she arrived apologizing. Her name was Nora. She was 38, and she came in pulling her coat off one arm at a time, a smear of flour still ghosting the cuff of her sweater because she'd come straight from the bakery she half-owned and had clearly meant to change and hadn't had time. Her hair was clipped up in a way that had given up an hour ago. She wasn't glamorous. She was warm in the way a kitchen is warm, like heat that had been doing real work all day. And she scanned the table once, found the empty chair beside Ethan, and Ethan watched something flicker across her face, a quick, practiced reading of the room, before she sat down and said, "Sorry, the ovens don't care about my social life." "Neither do mine," Ethan said. "Different ovens. Same problem." She looked at him then, properly, the first real look, and there was a flash of dry amusement under the tiredness. "You bake, I strip furniture. The fumes are basically the same lifestyle." That got a real laugh out of her, short and surprised, and across the table Ethan saw Russ glance at his girlfriend with a small, anticipatory smirk, the smirk of a man waiting for a punchline he'd written himself. Ethan didn't understand it yet. He just knew the temperature of the table was wrong, that everyone was a half-second too attentive, leaning in like an audience. Mark, to his credit, looked faintly sick about something. Nora ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and an iced tea, and Ethan noticed that too, the small economy of it, the way she did the math without seeming to. He learned, in the easy back and forth that followed, that she had a son named Leo who was 7 and currently obsessed with sharks to a degree that had begun to alarm his teachers. He learned that she'd opened the bakery with her sister, and that her sister had moved to Denver and left her holding most of it. He learned that her ex was around, technically in the way a draft under a door is around. She said all of this lightly, no self-pity, the way Ethan talked about his divorce, and he found himself doing a thing he hadn't done in a long time, which was wanting the other person to keep talking. It was Russ who broke it. But before Russ broke it, there was a stretch of maybe 20 minutes that Ethan would replay for the rest of his life, because in those 20 minutes he forgot to be careful. She asked him what the strangest thing he'd ever restored was, and he told her about a rocking chair a widower had brought in, 90 years old, the man's late wife's, and how the man had stood in the shop and cried when he saw it finished, and how Ethan had had to pretend to look for something in the back so the man could have the moment alone. "That's the job nobody tells you about," he said. "Half of it is wood. The other half is grief." Nora went quiet at that, and then she said, "I make wedding cakes I know are for marriages that won't last. I can usually tell at the tasting, and I make them perfect anyway because the day is still real even if the rest of it isn't." She looked at him. "We do the same job. We make broken things beautiful for people who don't deserve them yet." And Ethan felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in 2 years, the specific click of being understood by someone who wasn't trying to fix him, and he almost said something he'd have regretted for being too much, too soon. He didn't. He just refilled her iced tea from the pitcher, and she watched him do it, and the table around them carried on with its own conversations, none of them noticing that the joke they'd planned had already quietly failed. It was Russ who said the part out loud, loud enough to fold the side conversations into his, "You and Ethan, huh? The two most exciting people at the table." He let it hang. "We figured, you've both got, what do you call it, a lot going on." He smiled around the word. Ethan's got his little chairs. You've got the kid. Seemed like a match. A couple of people laughed before they decided whether they should. And there it was. Ethan felt it land in the room the way you feel a draft when a door opens behind you. The setup. The whole thing. The empty chair, the lateness they'd counted on, the cheapest item on the menu they'd predicted. Russ had brought him here to be paired with the woman the table had already decided was a punchline. The single mom, the package deal, the woman whose value they thought they'd already finished calculating. And the joke was that 2 leftovers had been put on a plate together for everyone else's entertainment. Ethan watched Nora's face do the thing he would remember for a long time afterward. It didn't crumble. It went still. It went to the careful, flat stillness of a person who has been the punchline of a room before and has learned that the only way to survive it is to pretend you're somewhere else. She reached for her iced tea so she'd have something to do with her hands. Ethan set his fork down. "Russ," he said. His voice didn't rise. It almost never rose. "You set this whole thing up, didn't you? The chair, the seating, you wanted to watch." Russ spread his hands, grinning committed now. "Lighten up, man, it's a joke." "You thought she'd be the embarrassed one," Ethan said. "That's the only funny part." The table went quiet in the specific way tables go quiet, when the person who was supposed to absorb the cruelty hands it back instead. Russ's grin faltered at the edges. "Here's what actually happened tonight," Ethan went on, still even, still unhurried the way he'd talk a customer through why their table was worth saving. "I sat down next to a woman who runs a business, raises a kid alone, came here straight off a 14-hour day, ordered the $8 plate so she could afford the babysitter, and was funnier in 20 minutes than you've been in 20 years, and you brought her here to laugh at her." He picked his fork back up. "You all decided who she was before she walked in. The embarrassing thing isn't her, it's that you were so sure. Nobody said anything." Russ opened his mouth, and then didn't. Mark was staring at the table like he wanted to apologize for the species. And Nora was looking at Ethan with an expression he couldn't name yet, something between disbelief and a question. She stood up. For one terrible second, Ethan thought she was leaving, that he'd made it worse, that decency delivered too late was just another kind of spotlight. But she picked up her coat and looked at him and said quietly, only to him, "I'm going to go." "Walk me out." He left 2 20s on the table for her plate and his, and he walked her out. The night air outside the restaurant was sharp and clean after the close warmth of the room, and for a moment they just stood under the awning while the parking lot lights buzzed and a few cars hissed by on wet asphalt. She pulled her coat tighter. The flower was still on her sleeve. He noticed, absurdly, that he wanted to know what she'd baked. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "I've handled worse than Russ. I handle worse than Russ at the school pickup line." "I know you have." He leaned against the brick. "That's sort of the point. People keep deciding you can handle it so they don't have to behave." She looked away, blinking, and when she looked back her eyes were bright but her voice was steady. "Most men in there would have laughed. The ones who didn't laugh would have at least let it slide. You—" She stopped, started again. "You corrected him like it cost you nothing." "It didn't cost me anything," Ethan said. "It cost him." She laughed at that, wet and a little broken, and wiped her eye with the back of the flowery cuff, and Ethan thought that was the realest thing he'd seen in 2 years. "I should get home," she said. "Leo's with my neighbor and she falls asleep on my couch by 9. She hesitated, and then she did a thing that Ethan understood, much later had taken her more courage than walking out of the restaurant had. She took her phone out and held it toward him. "I'm not going to stand here and pretend I'm not going to think about this all night. So, put your number in. If you don't, I'll spend a week deciding whether I should have asked. And I am too tired to lose a week." She'd said it out loud, plainly, and Ethan, who hadn't initiated anything with anyone in longer than he wanted to admit, simply took the phone and typed his number in and handed it back, because all he had to do, all he had ever had to do, was not be a coward when someone braver than him left the door open. "There," he said. "Now you don't have to lose the week." She texted him a single word from the car before she even pulled out of the lot. It said, "Coward-proof." He didn't understand it for a second, and then he laughed alone in the dark parking lot like a man who'd forgotten he could. The bakery, it turned out, smelled like the inside of a good memory. He went in on Sunday because she'd told him Sundays were slow and Leo was with the ex, and he found her behind the counter with flour to the elbow and her hair clipped up badly again, and she slid a coffee across to him without asking and said, "You came to my turf." Bold. He told her he restored furniture, and she told him the bakery had a dining table in the back room that her grandmother had owned, scarred and water-ringed and wobbling on one leg, and that she'd been meaning to throw it out for years and somehow never had. He asked if he could see it. She brought him back, and he ran his hand over the surface the way he did with every piece, reading it, and he said, "This is oak." Real oak. Nobody makes these anymore. You don't throw this out. You fix it. And Nora stood in the doorway of her own back room watching a man she'd known for 3 days care, with his whole attention, about something she'd been told her whole life wasn't worth keeping, and she said very quietly, "Yeah. Okay, fix it." They both knew by then they weren't only talking about the table. He started coming around on Sundays. Then, on the weeknights, the bakery closed early. He met Leo on the 4th Sunday, Nora's idea, on her terms, with the careful gatekeeping of a mother who'd learned the hard way that the men who couldn't handle a 7-year-old revealed themselves fastest. She'd warned him in the car beforehand, parked outside her own house with her hands tight on the wheel. "He gets attached," she said. "He's 7 and his dad cancels half his weekends, so he gets attached fast and hard, and if you're going to disappear, I need you to disappear now, today, before he learns your name." Her voice was flat with old grief. "I can survive you leaving. He's used up his quota of men who leave." "I'm not going to disappear," Ethan said. "Everybody says that, I know." He looked at the house. "So don't believe me yet, believe me in a year." She stared at him for a long second, then nodded once like a woman closing a deal she wasn't sure of, and they went inside. Ethan brought a wooden shark he'd cut and sanded in the shop, dorsal fin and all, the grain rubbed smooth enough to hold. Leo went silent with the particular reverence of a child handed exactly the right thing, turning it over and over, and then asked roughly 400 questions, the central one being whether sharks had bones. Ethan, who did not know whether sharks had bones, crouched down to his level and said, "I don't know. Let's find out." They spent 40 minutes on the living room floor with Leo's tablet and a library book, and Ethan learned that sharks have cartilage instead of bone, and Leo learned that a grown man would sit on a floor and not know something and not pretend otherwise, and Nora learned, watching from the kitchen doorway with a mug going cold in her hands, that this was the answer her ex had never once given. Not the shark facts, but the willingness to not have the answer and find it anyway. That was the whole thing. That was everything. There was a Thursday a few weeks into it that Ethan didn't plan and never forgot. The bakery closed at 6 on Thursdays, and he came by at 5 to help her stack chairs and wipe the cases, because she'd mentioned offhand that closing alone was the loneliest hour of her week, and he'd filed it away the way he filed everything that mattered. The light in the place at that hour was low and gold, the last sun coming sideways through the front glass and catching the flour that always hung in the air no matter how often she swept. It smelled like cinnamon and cooling metal and the particular sweetness of a day's bread going stale. She had her back to him, scrubbing the big mixer, and she started talking the way people do when they don't have to make eye contact. "His name was Dev," she said. "Leo's dad. He wasn't cruel. That's the part nobody believes. He never raised his hand, never raised his voice." She rinsed a paddle. "He just had opinions about everything. What I wore, how I ran this place, whether the bakery was a real plan or a cute hobby. And he had this way of being so calm about it that if I got upset I was the unreasonable one." She set the paddle down. "I spent 6 years apologizing for things that weren't wrong. You know what that does to a person? You stop being able to tell the difference between somebody loving you and somebody managing you. They feel the same from the inside. That's the trap." Ethan kept wiping the case. He'd learned that she said more when he didn't turn it into a moment. "What's the difference?" he said. "From the outside," she thought about it, "somebody who loves you wants to know what you think. Somebody who's managing you wants to know if you agree." She laughed. "Short. Took me 38 years to figure that out. Sometimes careful is just fear with better manners." Ethan said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. It had been sitting in him for 2 years, ever since his own marriage went quiet, ever since he'd realized that all his steadiness might have been a way of never risking anything. "I did the same thing in reverse. I was so careful nobody could ever accuse me of wanting too much. Turns out that's just a slower way of disappearing." She turned around then. Flour on her cheek, a dish towel over one shoulder, the gold light behind her. "How are you single?" she said, not flirting, almost annoyed. "How is a man who says things like that just walking around loose?" "Same way you are," he said. "The people who should have kept us were busy deciding we were the easy thing to put down." She crossed the kitchen, pulled the towel off her shoulder, and threw it at his chest. "Stop being right. It's unsettling." But she was smiling, and when he caught the towel she didn't step back, and for a second they just stood there in the closing time light. Close enough that he could have kissed her and didn't, because she'd taught him, without meaning to, that the gift wasn't the kiss, it was being the one man who waited for her to decide. She set her hand flat against the towel on his chest, just for a moment, just long enough to feel his heart, and then she went and locked the front door and flipped the sign, and Ethan understood that lonely hour was over for good. There was a night, weeks after that, when it nearly came undone. They were on her back porch under a string of lights she'd hung crooked and never fixed, a couple of beer bottles sweating on the metal table between them, the crickets going in the dark yard, and she got quiet in a way he'd learned meant something was coming. "I have to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to not be nice about the answer." She turned the bottle in her hands. "Is this a project for you, the table, me, the kid? Are we the broken thing you fix and feel good about?" Her voice didn't shake, but it cost her to keep it from shaking. "Because I've been somebody's project before, it feels like love right up until the part where they're proud of themselves for staying." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in years, and he understood that the whole thing hung on whether he answered it like a man trying to win or a man trying to tell the truth. "No," Ethan said. He didn't rush it. "I fix furniture because the work is worth it, and then I let it go to someone else's house, and I don't think about it again." "I'm not letting you go to someone else's house." He took a breath. "You're not the broken thing, Nora. You're the first room in 2 years that I didn't want to leave early." She set the bottle down. The crickets filled the space where words would have been. "Say that again," she said. "Which part?" "The part where you didn't want to leave early." He started to, and she crossed the space between the chairs and kissed him before he finished the sentence, her flowery hand on the side of his face, the string lights swimming overhead, the crickets and the cold beer and the whole quiet yard falling away, and Ethan, who had spent 2 years being careful, being steady, being the kind of man people decided they didn't have to behave around, kissed her back like a man who had finally stopped waiting to be chosen and realized he already had been. Her hand moved from his face to the collar of his shirt and held on. He could taste the beer and the cold night air, and underneath it something warm, like the bakery, like home before he'd known it had a name. When she pulled back, she didn't go far. Her forehead rested against his, both of them breathing, the lights painting little gold dots across her cheek. "I'm not made of glass," she said. "In case you were about to be careful again." "I noticed," he said. "Good." She kissed the corner of his mouth, softer this time. "Because I waited a long time to ask a decent man to stay, and I'd hate for him to break before I got to keep him. The complication, when it came in the form of a school carnival 3 weeks later, where Russ, because the world is small and friends are sticky, turned up because his nephew went to the same school, and saw Ethan holding Nora's hand at the ring toss booth with Leo riding on Ethan's shoulders, and couldn't help himself. "Wow," Russ said loud, the old grin. "So the joke worked out, huh? You two actually—" And before Ethan could do anything, before he could even set Leo down, Nora let go of his hand and stepped forward and said clearly in front of the booth and the parents and the cotton candy line, "There was never a joke, Russ. There was just you, thinking other people's lives were entertainment. We figured out months ago we were the only ones at that table worth knowing. You're the punchline now. Has been for a while. You just didn't get the memo." And she took Ethan's hand back and walked them toward the funnel cake stand. And Ethan didn't have to defend her, didn't have to stand in front of her, because she had stood up for herself in a parking lot of strangers and not needed him to do it. He'd only ever had to stand beside her. Russ stood there holding a stuffed prize he'd won for no one. The seasons turned the way they do when you stop counting them. The oak table, sanded, re-glued, 4 legs solid now, the water rings gone, the grain glowing under 3 coats of oil, moved out of the bakery's back room and into Nora's kitchen. Because it deserved a kitchen, Ethan said, and a kitchen deserved it. They ate at it most nights, the 3 of them, Leo narrating shark facts that may or may not have been true, while Nora rolled her eyes and Ethan said, "Let's find out," so many times it became the family motto, printed eventually on a mug Leo bought her for her birthday. There were small mornings in there, the kind that don't make stories but make lives. Ethan learning the bakery's 6 a.m. rhythm, the proofing and the preheat, standing at her shoulder with 2 coffees while the ovens woke up. Saturday afternoons in his shop with Leo perched on a stool sanding scrapwood into nothing in particular and calling it work. A rescued dog named inevitably Bruce after a shark. Nora falling asleep against Ethan's arm on the couch by 9, the way her neighbor used to, and Ethan not moving for an hour so he wouldn't wake her, learning that the loneliest hour of her week had quietly become his favorite. There was a Sunday morning, almost a year to the day from the dinner, when Ethan came down early to the bakery he now had his own key to, and found that Nora had left her grandmother's table, their table, set for 2 with the good chipped plates and a small velvet box sitting on a folded note in the center of the wood he'd saved. The note said, "You don't throw this out, you fix it, and then you keep it." And inside the box was not a ring for her but a key, a plain brass key, with a tag that read, "Front door, yours now." And Nora was standing in the doorway of the back room in her flour-dusted apron, watching him read it, exactly where she'd stood the first Sunday, and she said, "I'm not great at the kneeling thing. But I'm asking. I'm always going to be the one who asks. You just have to keep being the kind of man who says yes. And Ethan, who had walked into a restaurant a year before to be somebody's joke, crossed his own kitchen and kissed the woman who'd refused to be won. And he said yes, of course he said yes, he'd been saying yes since the night he refused to laugh. They got married in the bakery on a Sunday, with flour in the air and Leo holding the rings on a wooden shark he insisted was a ring bearer, and the crooked string lights from her back porch strung along the counter because she still hadn't fixed them and Ethan had decided he never would. Mark came, Russ wasn't invited, and nobody missed the joke, and Ethan, looking out across that warm, small room at a woman the world had told him to overlook, understood the only thing the night had ever been trying to teach him, which was that the cruelest thing people do isn't laughing at someone. It's deciding before they've looked that there's nothing there worth seeing. So here's what he'd ask you. What would you have done sitting at that table when the joke landed and the room leaned in to watch? Would you have laughed? Would you have let it slide? Or would you have set your fork down? And have you ever, in your own life, watched someone get written off before they got a chance, someone the room had already decided about, and wished later that you'd said something? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.